Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Leslie Liao. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has actively pursued a stronger alliance with the United States. However, this approach has coincided with an escalation of tensions with China. Notably, the approval of 4 additional military bases for U.S. forces has triggered strong disapproval from China. Does Marcos's predecessor, President Rodrigo Duterte's visit to China and a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping send signals over competition in balancing relations with the U.S. and China? Well, luckily for me, I have a knowledgeable panel to discuss that with me. Joining me today are Chenlung Kuo, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at United Daily News. Then we have Dr. Charles Wu, Department of Diplomacy Professor at National Chengchi University. And finally, Jiho Chang, DPP Councilor from Keelung City. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Since assuming office, Philippine President Marcos Jr. has taken a different approach from former President Rodrigo Duterte's pro-China stance. And Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has gone so far as to visit the United States within a year of him becoming the Philippine president. Deputy Editor-in-Chief, may I get your opinion on, does this mean that there are 2 different factions within the Philippines, one pro-U.S., one China?
The former President Duterte's visit of China is quite a surprise, and no one knows about this before he met actually with Xi Jinping. And I think China is having the approach of old friend. This is a similar approach China had been dealing with Dr. Kissinger. And by having Mr. Duterte as China's old friend, that Xi Jinping is encouraging him to play a more active role and more important role in mending the fence between China and Philippines. I think that is important because so far the daughter of Mr. Duterte, Sara, is acting as a vice president of Mr. Marcos. And also I think the view of Mr. Duterte actually fit what China is thinking, because before that, he was saying that Philippines would turn into a graveyard if ever being caught between a conflict between China and the United States. And he's also don't agree having more access of U.S. To Philippine military bases. So those are the things that his approach is very different from Mr. Marcos. His one is more on a diplomatic negotiation approach, since he is also a more anti-American background. So that means he cannot rely on American security guarantee, just like the current President Marcos had been.
Now, as you mentioned, Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s vice president is Rodrigo Duterte's daughter. Do you think Duterte's mission, the message of his mission, will reach the Philippine president?
Because Philippine political system is somewhat very different. I mean, in other countries, usually the vice president is running as a running mate of the current president, so they have very strong alliance. But in the case of Philippines, they are elected individually. So that means now already 1 year after the election, Sara is now having some differences already with the President Marcos' own faction. So maybe she will posing a big challenge in the next presidential elections, but so far I don't think she will have that much influence in the policy.
Now, Dr. Wu, I'd like to jump to you because we're dealing with a foreign policy issue here. And as we've observed, Marcos Jr. has talked about the South China Sea in his second address, State of the Union address, or State of the Nation address to the Philippines. Does this mean is he taking a more assertive stance on foreign policy because the South China Sea is very contested?
Yeah, some people and some political observers mentioned that when Marcos stepped out of power, and he kind of switched from the Duterte's pro-China policy to a more kind of heavily dependent on United States security. He even mentioned that if there's any kind of assault from mainland China on the South China issue, it will invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty designed in 1951. I think this is very provocative announcement speech this time when Marcos visited the United States. And, and not only this, he also mentioned during the Harris, Vice President Harris visit last year, they also kind of agree on with EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreements, which allow United States to kind of circulate, rotate the troops in the Philippines, and also they allow United States to use the 5 different the facilities to operate their military the soldiers. So I think Marcos right now, he wants to use this kind of, we call it the hedging policy, which is try to bring more security bets on the United States sides. However, don't forget, Marcos also went to visit Beijing this January to discuss about the bilateral business and bilateral trade relations between Beijing and Manila. They also discussed how to kind of discuss and talk about the cooperation on the joint development on the South China Sea, especially to resume the cooperation between the Chinese oil company and also Philippine national oil companies. So we can say that Marcos, he is very smart. He knows how to play between the two great powers. However, right now he emphasizes more on the security issues with the United States, try to create this kind of deterrence policy against Beijing.
Thank you. Councilor, from a political perspective, Xi Jinping emphasized that he hoped Duterte could play a bigger role in crafting Philippine and Chinese relations. As we've seen these political figures from the U.S. go to China, as well as such as Henry Kissinger. And there's a question of how much influence he can hold over U.S. policy. In the same vein, how much influence can Rodrigo Duterte hold in Philippine policy?
I think, of course, in China's interest, they would love to have Duterte's influence still there in the Philippine politics. But and I think it's going to last for a period of time where the Philippines leadership can play one off against another, where you're sort of walking on the thin line between China and the U.S. in this time of turbulence. But I don't think it's going to last. The current China directive, of course, is to make sure that the Philippines there's a clear channel of communication between the two, and there is still a pro-China faction within the Philippine, even the presidential office and also in the parliament. But I would say, while China is doing this, the U.S. is not going to stand aside, just letting things happen like this. I think sooner or later, the U.S. would put more pressure on the Philippine leadership into making an even more drastic stance with the U.S. in this sort of tug of war between the U.S. and China. And I think the Philippines, of course, it tries very hard to play this middleman, but it's not going to always be like this. That's what I'm saying.
Dr. Wu, would you agree with that assessment? Because from what I hear from you, we're playing a balancing act right now with the Marcos administration, but we also have Duterte tugging the strings over here. So is Philippines moving towards more a pro-China stance with all these factors in play?
We can say that, let's compare between Duterte and Marcos. Why Duterte, people say that he used a more pro-China policy. Remember when 2016, when he first time got elected, the first trip he made is to Beijing, talk about business and how to resume their bilateral cooperation on business and economic relations. They also talk about how to kind of lower down the South China Sea issue. Even Philippines and China, they have serious kind of conflicts in the South China Sea. For example, 2013, the Scarborough Shoal disputes. In 2025, they even have the stand up on the Winsup, the reefs. So let's see how the two countries they cooperate, because if you remember correctly, 2017 to 2019, China and Philippines, they made a kind of cooperation on we call the group seat corporations. Philippines got the kind of gift from mainland China about several kind of very expensive groupers, and the fishermen in Philippines try to raise them up and sail back to the mainland China. Like what I mentioned, they also 2018, Duterte also discussed with Xi Jinping how they can jointly develop the South China Sea on the natural gas issues. However, because the constitutions, Filipino constitutions constraints, they cannot negotiate about the revenues because China wants to get about 50 of the revenues from the joint developments on natural gas, while Philippines constitution say they need to get 60%. So when they have this kind of talking war on these issues, this kind of joint developments got stopped. So Duterte stopped the negotiation and cooperations. But let's look at Marcos. Marcos knows that the South China Sea issue is the core national interest about their survival. He wants to make sure first South China Sea issue will not repeat again. Like for example, the PLA Navy will show up one day in front of the territorial water or even EEZ and give kind of threats. So the Marcos, he kind of switched the side to United States to even have this kind of military drills. We can see the largest military drills for past decades. They just finished this April. They call the shoulder-to-shoulders military drills, which give a huge kind of impact on the China and the Filipino bilateral relations. So like what I say, in conclusion, if Duterte is using this kind of more pro-China policy, Marcos, he's trying to move a little bit away from China. However, he still wants to play this kind of hedging card between China and the United States. This is for sure.
Deputy Editor, if I may, we see this dilemma right now, growing dilemma between pro-China and pro-U.S. policy within the Philippines, and that's not unlike what's happening in Taiwan. How does the Philippines reconcile such sentiment with, as the doctor just said, you have on one side the economic factor, on the other side you have the security factor with the South China Sea?
I would say that now the game is pretty much open, that both China and the United States are competing with Philippines. But it's different 6 years ago when Duterte first became the president. At the time, Duterte is actually on the blacklist of America. He cannot visit the United States because he had been holding anti-American demonstration against the base and so on and so forth. And at the time, the U.S. don't have the economic incentive for Philippines to turn to. Rather, it was China who is offering a Belt and Road Initiative and other investment schemes, and that make Duterte more lean toward China. But now, with President Marcos in town, I think that both President Marcos find that he can have the security guarantee from the United States, and also U.S. is now offering more and more economic incentive. I think that the new American ambassador is saying that there's going to be a big trade and investment delegation coming to Philippines at the end of the year. So U.S. also noticed that he cannot woo the Philippines without giving the economic incentive. So I think now it's a more balanced game. Both sides had their leverage nowadays.
The President, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he did mention that the South China Sea issue is always a sticking point in the conflict between the two. However, are there any other rifts between Philippines and China that might get in the way of developments between the two countries?
I think the South China Sea issue about territory is the major issues, security issues between Philippines and China. How can these two sides try to settle down these kind of disputes, make these areas not that dangerous? It's based on two leaders' wisdoms. Like what I say, how can they use the joint developments to peacefully develop these areas? It's also from Beijing. If Beijing maintain this kind of assertive policies, they will create a lot of pressure on Philippines. And the Philippines will switch their side to the United States for sure. Because no other secondary countries, they can even handle this kind of pressure without saying anything. Remember, like Duterte, what Duterte mentioned during his term, he said, it's me allow Chinese fishermen to fish here. Wait for seconds, is really Duterte's his job or achievements? No, he even cannot handle the pressure from Beijing. But he knows how to play around this kind of pressure and let him keep in the positions. So like I say, territories is major security issues between these two countries.
So there's no way forward. That's the big hurdle that they need to get past. Not many other rifts. It doesn't really matter what other issues there are because that is such a major obstacle.
Yes.
Got you. Let's move on because we are talking about defense. However, it's not just the South China Sea that the Philippines is looking at, let's analyze the statements made by the Philippine Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro. He mentioned that the Philippines is closely monitoring the threat posed by China to Taiwan. He said, "We continue to plan on all contingencies, not merely any flashpoint between China and Taiwan, but any contingency within the theater." What could be the reasons behind the Philippines' heightened concern? Does this suggest any unusual actions taken by China, Deputy Editor?
I think the Philippines is just like any country around this region are ready for a contingency happening between Taiwan and China. If ever China is going to attack Taiwan, Philippine President Marcos had mentioned several times they are worried about, first of all, there's about 40 to 50,000 of Philippine expats working as housemaid in Taiwan. How can the Philippines can come to their rescue? That's one. And the second thing is because it's very near the Philippines from Taiwan, they are worried that they may have a massive refugee coming over from Taiwan to Philippines. How they are going to handle that? Those are the contingencies that Philippines are worried. Plus, there's another thing that Philippines would be under the treaty obligation with the United States, would have to join hands with the U.S. and get involved with the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. I think those are the things they are very worried.
Dr. Wu, is there any other consideration beyond the large Philippine contingent in Taiwan that would compel the Philippines to get involved in the Taiwan Strait?
I agree Mr. Kuo's arguments. First is the geopolitical distance and geopolitics distance also. We can say Taiwan and Philippines, we are very close to each other. If there's any contingencies or kind of military conflicts happen in these areas, Philippines need to handle these kind of contingencies. Their fishermen, their kind of the naval guards, how can they handle these kind of conflicts? Or even the player A Navy surrounded Taiwan, I think it's first national missions or national security issues they need to handle. Second thing also, the Filipino workers working in Taiwan. It's quite important economic issues, also their revenues from. So like what I said, if you remember during 2022, we had kind of fishery disputes with Filipino governments. And how Ma Ying-jeou's government handled this one, they put this kind of economic coercions, threatened to ban this kind of exchange of people and also Filipino workers working in Taiwan in order to what? To get the Filipino government's attention to arrest the Coast Guards. So like what I say, Filipino government, they are democratic governments. They need to listen to the people's voices. So if there's any kind of contingency happen in the Taiwan Strait, they will create some economic and security effects on the two countries.
Here's another question. You mentioned fishery disputes, and we have the first island chain as always, but we also saw that Japan is considering giving assistance to the Philippines in defense of this region. Now, is Japan another factor that might the Philippines might throw into to say whether we're pro-U.S. or pro-China? Because if Japan accepts the assistance from if the Philippines accepts Japanese assistance, I can't imagine that China would be very happy about that.
We need to go back to the very important question. First is Japan, United States, and the Philippines, the trilateral relations. Japan and United States, right now they have very strong bilateral kind of security pacts between each other. Japan and Philippines, they can resume their kind of security pacts. Then how these three countries in the future cooperate together, I think is very important security issues for the China threats. If United States as a core, or we can say it's hub and spoke framework, United States as a hub, if United States can strengthen this kind of bilateral relation with Japan and United States, and also United States with Philippines, probably in the future, if there's any contingency occur in these regions, United States can use this kind of hub and spoke and create we call a security kind of wheel or security island chain to resist any kind of potential attacks from China. Like what I say, in my knowledge, I don't know whether there's any kind of security exchange between Japan and Philippines. If yes, they probably in the future will do more. Like I say, both of them are democratic countries. When you say democracies, they pay attention to kind of commitments and also we call it the contract. So if both of countries, they can pay strong kind of commitments for their security compacts, it's very good for the security bonding in this region for all the countries.
Councilor, while we're at it, we see this kind of chain alliance coming, at least they're thinking about this, protecting this chain, despite that China's ambitions don't seem to be waning at all. If anything, they seem to be even more aggressive. Does President Xi Jinping's kind of ambition for the area, does that signal to political expansionism or a desire for political expansionism?
There is never a single doubt in my mind, or in many Taiwanese mind, of what China's ambition is in this region. And I think the world has sort of went through this honeymoon phase with China for the last 2, even 3 decades. Now, some woke up early, some are still in the withdrawal phase of that honeymoon, but sooner or later, countries are withdrawing from this honeymoon phase. And we see the sign from Italy opting out from the One Belt, One Road initiative. And that's like the first indication of what's about to come in what many other partners of the One Belt, One Road initiatives would do. And so I think in that sense, the Philippines, I think they're slowly grasping the scope of how China's ambition will play out in the coming decades or 2. And for the time being, it is in the interest of Japan and the United States to have the trilateral security pact between, including the Philippines, to be as strong as possible. But I think the Philippines is yet to catch up with the sense of urgency, just like that of the U.S. and Japan.
Deputy Editor, is there something you'd like to add?
Yes. So far, we only talk about bilateral relations. But if we open our map, we can see that there's a first island chain, go all the way from Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines. And the only way that China can penetrate the first island chain is either go through the channel between Taiwan and Japan, or go through the channel, Boss Channel, between Taiwan and Philippines. We have enough attention to the northern waterway, but we don't have enough attention to what's happening between Taiwan and Philippines right now. If ever China want to penetrate the first island chain, it was consider the final confrontation with the United States. They were going to be a big military confrontation with American troops in Guam and even to Hawaii. So why the 4 military facilities U.S. can have access to in Philippines is that important, because 2 of them is right in the at the neck of those waterway. It can control the waterway, and by not letting the POA ships or even the aircraft carrier to cross that strait. And I think there's also some listening device that's going to be planted under the sea to monitor any submarine ever going to cross the waterway. So I think in the end, that Philippines will be a crucial link in this first island chain, both between Taiwan, Japan, and the United States, as well as with Australia. That is going to be a future new member of this defense.
Thank you, Editor. I'd like to thank you for joining us on this edition of Taiwan Talks. And if you liked our show, please do like and subscribe. Until next time, take care.